Welcome to World History. For this unit, we're going to be diving into a concept called European absolutism. You might remember from our Asia unit that over time, leaders in Asia used a variety of different ways to increase the power of the government in order to create or to reform their societies. Well, we're going to start seeing that same process happening in Europe, because up until this point in Europe, generally, national governments had been relatively weak. So when we say absolutism, we mean power is going to go to the ruler and away from the nobles and the other rich people in society. And so this is going to happen in a bunch of different places in a bunch of different ways, but we're going to start with France, because during this time period, France becomes the leading power of Europe and one of the more powerful nations in the world. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe how the early French rulers dealt with religious conflict in France, analyze how the reforms of Louis XIV changed the French government, and then look at the long-term effects of Louis XIV's rule. So let's dive in and discuss these things. France began to become a modern country with the rise of what's called the Bourbon Dynasty, which was a line of rulers that would rule France for about 300 years. The Bourbon Dynasty started with a guy named Henry, who was a Protestant. As hopefully you remember from our Reformation unit, Europe was rocked by religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, as some rulers converted to Protestantism and some rulers stayed Catholic. Well, France existed right in the middle of this, and there were a series of civil wars in France, eventually won by Henry, who, as we said, was a Protestant. But once he took over France, he decided to convert to Catholicism, saying that it's worth converting to Catholicism in order to capture the country. And so he, as a ruler, would embrace religious tolerance, but he and the French government would become Catholic, which is going to become very important later. And so France is a Catholic country that deals with significant problems with religious conflict. The Bourbon Dynasty then continued with Louis XIII. Louis XIII, pictured here, was not a very interested ruler, but fortunately for him, he handed off power to a guy named Cardinal Richelieu, which we see written here and pictured over here, who was a very effective ruler. Richelieu divided up France into a series of provinces in order to make them easier to govern. These provinces were called generalités, and each of these provinces had a sort of a local council of judges which would help make decisions. And so with this, he could then direct or pass directives down to these parlements, as they were known, and then they would be able to sort of rule on this and then put whatever the policy is to work within their specific region. He also created these offices called intendants, which we see here, which are sort of royal agents who would go out and make sure that the things that the king wanted done was done. These intendants would grow in power over the next couple kings, and it's important to note that having these royal representatives who could speak with the king's voice was very important in order to make sure that the things that the king wanted done got done. So under Louis XIII, and specifically under Cardinal Richelieu, the power of the French government grew, and the king was able to do more. One of the things that was really causing tension in France was the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes was a policy of religious toleration. The Edict of Nantes was sort of like the Peace of Augsburg in that it allowed people to worship whatever religion they chose, be it Protestant or Catholic, but that led to numerous religious flare-ups and conflicts, as we see here. And over time, especially Cardinal Richelieu started to weaken the Edict of Nantes and push France closer to Catholicism. It was felt that if a country only had one religion, this would be a way to create unity because the king could help control the church and the church could help support the king. The greatest king in French history is Louis XIV. One of the reasons he was such a great king is because he ruled pretty much forever. He's one of the longest ruling kings in European history, rising to the throne as a child and then ruling until he was quite old. In his early years, he also had a cardinal ruling things for him. Here's a Cardinal Mazarin, whose name you don't need to know. But know that he also had a cardinal sort of overseer, but eventually he came into his own and became an incredibly successful ruler. One of the things that Louis XIV tried to do throughout his reign is he had to deal with an uprising very early on. And this uprising was predominantly nobles in an area called La Fronde. This noble uprising convinced Louis XIV that nobles had too much power and that these rich nobles, their power needed to be weakened in order to ensure that the king could get what he wanted done and would be able to rule absolutely. Louis XIV expressed his power over the nobles in a number of different ways. One was by building the fabulous Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles represented the power and majesty of the king. You can see here sprawling gardens, massive complexes, huge amounts of rooms. It demonstrates the wealth and the power of the Bourbon Dynasty and really reinforces the idea of divine right, or the idea that the king rules because God has appointed him as ruler. By centralizing religious authority and by making sure that the Catholic Church was fully in line with him, Louis could use the power of the Church to ensure that the things that he wanted to get done were done. He also forced all the nobles to live with him at Versailles, if they wanted to get any type of government favors or anything else. And so if you wanted to be anyone in France, you had to move to the Palace of Versailles because only there would the king give out important offices, push land reforms, and do stuff like that. And so because the nobles had to be there with the king and weren't in their provinces with their supporters, their power was weakened and his power was strengthened. And it got to the point where he was so famous and powerful that the nobles would fight to figure out who would stand next to him when he woke up in the morning, or who would be allowed to stand outside his bedroom door as he slept, because you wanted to be close to the king so he would give you the sort of offices and power that you wanted. And so this increased the power of the king and decreased the power of the rich nobles. One downside of the Palace of Versailles is, of course, it was very, very expensive. And so this would start putting the French monarchy into debt, which would be a problem that would plague them for the next several generations. The other way that Louis increased his own power is he increased the power of the intendants. Louis gave direct instructions to his intendants and required them to report directly to him, therefore making sure that he was the one who was giving these orders. And he made the attendants sacrosanct, which basically meant that an attack on any attendant was the same as attack on the king, and the punishment would be death for any person who laid a hand on a royal representative. The other thing he started doing is he started selling offices to nobles. And so if you wanted to be posted in a government job, you would have to, as opposed to applying for it, you would have to give the king a bribe. This office would then come with special privileges like exemption from taxation and probably a royal salary, but also it came with sometimes titles and prestige. And so by selling these offices, Louis ensured that his government would have lots of money, and the nobles would have less money and would be indebted to him for buying these offices. And so all of this stuff further increased the power of the king while weakening the power of everyone else in France. Louis also brought the policies of mercantilism to France. We talked about mercantilism last unit. It's an international system of trade. Under Louis, France established colonies in North America, specifically in the Mississippi River Valley, where they got many valuable furs. And they also established sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The problem with Louis XIV's plan is it involved an active king who was very engaged in all of the day-to-day governance. And Louis lived for so long that he actually outlived all of his sons. And so when the next king came to the throne, it was actually Louis's grandson, Louis XV, and he was not a very engaged king. Because he didn't pay attention to a lot of these rules and a lot of this organization, the government of France began to sort of fall apart. And France got dragged into a series of expensive wars known as the 7 Years' War, in which France gained nothing but lost all their colonies. This is known as the French and Indian War in American history. And so for Louis XV, nothing great is gained. France loses some colonies, and France goes into more debt. But there's still a wealthy and powerful country, so everything in France is okay for now. We'll definitely be coming back to this story later to tell the final story of the Louis and the Bourbon Dynasty, because man, it's a doozy. So this brings us back to our standards. Hopefully you can describe how the early Bourbons dealt with religious conflict, analyze the reforms of Louis XIV, and look at the long-term effects of the changes that Louis XIV made to France.